requested by Captain Andy. This April 1st, I'm going to talk about the 1974 Gene Roddenberry-helmed TV movie Planet Earth, directed by Mark Daniels, who directed 15 episodes of Star Trek, and written by Roddenberry and Juanita Bartlett. It's a pretty surreal film that may have indirectly inspired last year's April 1st focus, The Last Man on Planet Earth. The plot involves a man from our time, Dylan Hunt, played by John Saxon, braving a post-apocalyptic world that has a society where women keep men as slaves. It's a pretty overt masochistic sex fantasy that attempts to make some sort of commentary on feminism.
Women's lib? Or women's lib gone mad?
Roddenberry is best known for creating Star Trek, and he was never able to make anything else to match it in popularity, though not for lack of trying. After Star Trek ended, he wanted to make a TV series about a man from the 20th century who participates in a cryogenic suspension experiment and wakes up in the far future after a nuclear holocaust. Sort of a non-comedic version of Futurama. To attempt this, he made 3 TV movies, each conceived of as a pilot movie, but none of them caught on, and the result is a trilogy of films connected by a loose continuity: Genesis 2, Planet Earth, and Strange New World. Genesis 2 has Dylan, played by Alex Cord, wake up in 2133 to find himself inside a country called Pax, named from the Latin word for peace. Pax citizens present themselves as the good guys, but an assistant named Lyra covertly informs him that Pax is actually evil, and Lyra's home country of Tyrania has the real good guys. So Dylan escapes Pax with her and travels to Tyrania, only to discover that Tyrania runs on slavery. They only think they're the good guys because they can't see their own evil. It's a pretty decent twist, though honestly the name Tyrania should have been a major tip-off. Dylan sabotages them and rejoins Pax in the end. While in Tyrania, Dylan observes a woman with a male slave, said to be from a country where women own men. Presumably, Roddenberry wanted to make a future Genesis 2 episode about Dylan going there, and this becomes the basis of Planet Earth. Planet Earth reboots the continuity a bit and introduces the Kriegs, monstrous evolutions of humanity who are good with technology. Essentially Morlocks from the Time Machine, except above ground because Pax is underground, built from a network of underground sub-shuttles.
That's a little redundant.
The Kriegs kind of remind me of the communist warthogs from Tailspin. A Krieg injures the leader of Pax, Kimbridge, played by Ry Tasco, and the only one who can save his life is a doctor named Jonathan Connor,
John Connor,
played by Jim Antonio. Unfortunately, the evil Confederacy of Ruth captured Connor, so Dylan has to go rescue him. As the Confederacy of Ruth doesn't recognize men as people, he pretends to be a slave and travels with a female companion named Harper-Smythe, played by Janet Markleton, to pose as his owner. Say, that sounds like a good plan. I don't see any way that could end terribly. Right away, the plot is politicized. The Confederacy of Ruth represents both the Confederate States of America and feminism, or women's liberation, as it was popularly called in the 1970s. Roddenberry simultaneously wants to criticize a fictional country built on slavery like the historical Confederacy, and a fictional sex fantasy about what paranoid men fear that women's lib could turn into. Aside from misrepresenting feminism, it diminishes the power of the message to force 2 different metaphors together. He could have talked about the actual Confederacy that literally existed, but he decided to talk about feminism instead, thus weakening the actual legitimate criticism of a country built on slavery. There are actual legitimate criticisms to be made of the racism of first-wave feminism, which was tied into the abolition movement, and there was much misogyny in the slavery industry. But Roddenberry saw none of that nuance and instead pushed a sex fantasy about paranoid fears of white women oppressing white men, as white people once oppressed black people. Roddenberry is often called a feminist. It's true that he was progressive for his time. There are multiple areas in Star Trek where he wanted to be more progressive than what the executives would allow, most notably with Number 1, who was going to be a woman fulfilling the same sort of subordinate role of Spock to Kirk. Then Pike. She was dismissed as unsympathetic. However, he was still a product of his time, and I think he deserves less praise than he gets. I think people who like Star Trek tend to give him more of a pass than they would if someone else who didn't make Star Trek. Having a whole movie about feminism being evil seems like a big red flag to me. Planet Earth pushes the message that gender equality is good, but that feminism is dangerous. It's essentially the 1970s version of I'm not a feminist, I'm an egalitarian. Saying you're for equality is all well and good, but it leads to promoting the status quo and rejecting all criticism when you don't just take a stand and say that you're for the liberation of all women. The idea that giving up your power to oppress people will lead to the currently oppressed oppressing you is just paranoid conservatism, clinging to a status quo representing civility. And all of these people eventually wind up on the wrong side of history. Roddenberry's less than equal vision of gender equality can be seen with the citizens of Pax, which is fundamentally patriarchal. In Genesis 2, Cambridge's title was Primus, as in number 1. Insert Star Trek joke here. But in Planet Earth, he's called Pater, as in patriarch, as in good patriarchal Pax versus evil matriarchal Ruth. As seen through Harper-Smythe, women participate in important matters, but they're in the minority. Good, non-oppressive women of Pax like Harper-Smythe are naturally meek and need to be led by stronger men. Even when they need to send people into the Confederacy of Ruth, Dylan is the agent of choice, with Harper-Smythe only as his assistant to allow him access. One would think that she alone could be sent in, but this never occurs to anyone. It's sexist even before we get to the demonization of feminism. Dressed as a slave and his mistress, they enter the Confederacy and they encounter one of the slave owner women, or as the back of the box calls her, a Confederacy dominatrix, named Marg, played by Diana Muldaur, whatever. This is clearly a sex fantasy. Marg fulfills a sexy dominant woman role. The marketers call her a dominatrix to get masochistic men with slavery fantasies to buy the movie. I can understand that fantasy and why it makes sense to produce fiction with that sex appeal. I mean, True Blood derives a lot of appeal from women imagining themselves as Suke, owned by Vampire Bill. There is room for BDSM fantasies in genre fiction. The problem comes from taking this over-the-top fantasy and trying to make some serious political commentary from it. They turn feminism into a sex fantasy with exaggerated antagonism designed solely to fulfill aspects of the male sex fantasy, and then call it political commentary on how feminism is evil, when its depiction of evil is only constructed to fulfill a sex fantasy for male consumption. It's disingenuous and hypocritical.
Women's lib gone mad.
Another problem with the Confederacy of Ruth being fundamentally a sex fantasy is that it dilutes the slavery metaphor. At times, it feels like Planet Earth is seriously trying to show why slavery is awful, and why the Confederate States shouldn't be romanticized. But it's hard to take that seriously when the Confederacy is saturated with sex appeal. It's like it's saying, slavery is terrible, but isn't it sexy when women enslave men? It shouldn't be because feminism is evil. A very sexy evil. To be opposed wherever we find it. Except when it's sexy. You know, even if its point weren't severely misguided, it would still be lost. Sex fantasies are fundamentally absurd, even more so than other fantasies. When you're into it, you're willing to forgive the absurdity in order to get off on what it offers. When you're not into it, better offer something else, or else it's just gonna be boring and unintentionally hilarious. I fall into the second camp. While I can get into slavery fantasies like that of True Blood, Planet Earth does not do anything for me. The actors aren't particularly attractive, the characters aren't compelling, and the political angle offends me. So Planet Earth becomes a rather boring movie with moments of unintentional hilarity.
I bid a ram. A ram!
Dangerously cheesy.
The Confederate Amazons are kind of bizarrely barbaric. Tyrania was a little more realistic in depicting slavers as embracing faux civility. These women practically grunt and throw rocks at each other. It seems like they don't have any kind of police or military to keep the order. They just steal things from each other and beat each other up to establish dominance. Something about the way she slaps her just makes me laugh. It's the cheesiness coupled with a bizarre barbarism that just makes no sense. Dylan is taken to a slave cafeteria where he and the other slaves are given gruel. Another slave told him that the food was drugged, so he doesn't eat it. He only pretends to eat it and trades his bowl with that of another slave until it's empty. There is an unintentionally funny series of glances from the woman supervising them as she tries to catch him doing something wrong. It's almost a Monty Python skit, except they're actually going for drama. She ends up an idiot who thinks she's won. Meanwhile, Harper-Smythe makes it to a farm. The lady of the house, Treese, played by Sally Kemp, rejects her until Harper-Smythe bests her in combat. Why is it that I constantly hear that Roddenberry was all about pacifism and non-violent conflict resolution? His characters constantly solve things by combat. Treese explains Confederacy ideology, which makes no sense in such a way as to demonize feminism. It's kind of what misogynistic men say about women reversed, but it's also kind of pseudo-fascist, like the Catwoman of the Moon. as a means of showing women can be as messed up as male institutions, as Last Man on Planet Earth tried to do, with its confused condemnation of female FBI agents bombing a male terrorist group, who were clearly dangerous terrorists. The main difference between Planet Earth and those other films is that there's no Hitler figure among the women. There is just a different culture with a problematic social structure, like the exaggerated misogyny of the Mongol derivative people in Stargate SG-1, Season 1, Episode 4, Emancipation. She explains that the now commonplace submission-inducing drug is problematic because it reduces fertility, and now the birth rates are low. It's implied that she doesn't follow the custom herself. Her slaves seem a bit more independent than the other slaves. Dylan attempts an escape, but Marg catches him and force-feeds him the submission-inducing drug. Marg takes him to the auction the next day, and Harper-Smythe shows up to claim him. This leads to a fight between the two women, which is technically a feminist element. You rarely see a woman fighting a woman to save a man. Harper-Smythe wins, and Marg becomes her friend because the Amazons are Pokemon. While Harper-Smythe collects Dylan, the women start talking about wanting children. While women can reasonably want children, and matriarchal women could reasonably talk about wanting children, this seems just a bit stereotypical. Of course, women would talk about children if they're not talking about men. That is their whole deal, right? Treese shares her theory about the drug causing infertility. Marg says that they need the drug to properly dominate men. Treese says that a real mistress doesn't need a drug to stay dominant, and suggests that Marg is insufficient as a mistress, and is afraid that her men would dominate her without the drug.
I'd like to see the male who could dominate me.
Perhaps that's exactly what you'd like. Secretly.
And here we go. We get to this sexist trope. The woman is not really dominant. She's just looking for a man strong enough to dominate her. This is old sexism about feminism, characterizing it as less about women's liberation as it is about dominant women who aren't really dominant, but just want a super dominant man to dominate them and put them in their place. Then they could comfortably submit. This is Taming of the Shrew sexism applied to modern politics in order to disrespect women fighting for equal rights. Like Larry Talbot, this is a trope that just won't die, with movies as late as 2015's blockbuster Jurassic World featuring it. It is unfortunately as relevant today as it is in 1974. It's a little better in that Treese positions herself as actually dominant in contrast to Marg, but Treese doesn't have nearly as much screen time as Marg does, and the fact that it features at all is a problem. Treese calls a crowd so Harper-Smythe could ask about Connor.
Are you the legal guardian of John Connor?
Marg says she owns most of the outsiders, and invites her to come back to her place to check out her slaves. Unfortunately, this is not a come-on. Harper-Smythe has some time alone with Dylan, and tries to snap him out of it by romancing him. He is essentially roofied, so this is sexual assault. Great. Despite the lack of any real consent, this is a bit feminist because it positions her in a bit of a Captain Kirk role. I mean, it's not Buffy, but whatever. Of course, her having the Captain Kirk role is only possible through extremely contrived circumstances, and she slides back into the subordinate role when lucid men show up. Given this bit of Kirkishness, I am curious to where a Planet Earth series could have taken her, but we'll never know. Harper-Smythe finds Connor,
John Connor,
who is lucid because he was smart enough to figure out for himself not to eat the food. She explains the situation. He gives Dylan an antidote for the drug, and explains that the drug is a leftover chemical weapon from the 20th century. I think Connor would have been her McCoy stand-in, along with a stand-in for Spock. Unfortunately, we don't see Not McCoy and Not Spock interact. Not Spock doesn't have pointed ears, though, so how interesting could it be? Think pitchforks and blonde hair. First and foremost, they need to get Connor out so he can save Kimbridge. Connor tells Harper-Smythe to trade Dylan for him. That way Connor can save Kimbridge, and they could come back for Dylan. Connor also distributes the antidote into the slave food supply to make all of the Confederacy men lucid. Marg accepts the trade because she's attracted to him, and of course, secretly wants a man to dominate her. Dylan pretends to be drugged and talks about how he has 14 wives and is super studly, so Marg really wants to have sex with him. While kind of a mean thing to do, I don't think it's misleading enough to qualify as rape by deception, and there is still a heavy power dynamic victimizing him, so I don't see a big problem there, except as it fits into the idea that she really wants a man to dominate her. He says that he needs to prepare by having a feast and them both getting drunk, and she obliges. While drunk, he babbles about how her matriarchal world is an inverse of his time's patriarchal world. Obviously not true. Even in the 1970s, patriarchy isn't gore, and that women's lib would seem to make sense in his world, while men's lib would seem to make sense in her world, but what he really supports is people's lib. So, I'm not a feminist, I'm an egalitarian, who ultimately supports the patriarchal status quo. The Krieg show up, because these two groups never interacted before. Whatever. The Krieg demand the chemical weapon. All of these dominant women are spontaneously made helpless, so the now lucid male slaves have to fight for their women, as is the supposed natural state of things. The women have a council meeting and decide to end use of the drug, and it's implied that in a few years everyone will just go back to the natural gender roles. Because the Confederate States totally depended on a drug to keep black people enslaved, and when they suspended it, everyone became equal. Oh no, wait, it took one of the most deadly land wars, lots of bloodshed, years and years of racism. People still romanticize the Confederate States and slavery, even now in 2016. But no, just getting rid of the drug, that fixes everything. This is stupid. Everyone gets back to Pax. There's some sexual tension between Dylan and Harper-Smythe that reminds me of that between Jack and Sam in Stargate SG-1. The movie ends, promising thousands of other adventures in the series, or one. This movie is something else. It tries to be a serious commentary on gender politics, but it doesn't understand gender politics. There are points when it almost seems like feminist commentary, in that the women embody sexist male figures, but then it's only through caring about men instead of women. And I'm not convinced it's not just a stab at humor. The slavery commentary is undermined by trying to make it about gender instead of race. And the depiction of feminism is just so off-point that it's just one big straw man fight. And even the point it tries to make is undermined by the fact that the exaggerated antagonism is so obviously put in there for male sexual satisfaction. It's just a big sexist mess.